Oh yeah, let's do something.
All right, we'll get started. Karl, can you hear me all right?
I can, yes.
Cool. All right, so I am thrilled to introduce Karl Kullman. He is Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urban Design at UC Berkeley. And he also comes from the Global South as well. He's an Australian. So some similarities in accent. So if you can understand me, you should be able to understand Karl. But I have been reading Karl's work for quite a long time. And as I mentioned in the kind of the poster as well, I was absolutely thrilled and very, very lucky to have him as one of the reviewers for my PhD thesis. So I love the way he thinks about landscape and practices that through design research. And I am very excited to hear about what he's going to share with us today. And I'll leave that up to you, Karl.
Great, thanks. First, can you see my slides? My slides?
All good.
All good to go. Okay. Hi, everyone. Greetings from Berkeley, where it's a rainy old day here. I've actually been here for 15 years now. I was just telling Sean, time flies, and I'm kind of there's a few imminent retirements away from people that I'll be then the longest serving person in the department, which is bizarre. But there's a new generation of really whip smart geniuses coming through, my new colleagues, and so it's kind of exciting times for the future. And speaking of geniuses, you have your own resident one in Sean. As he mentioned, I was lucky to be an external examiner for his really brilliant PhD. So we're actually meeting for the first time today. I know you probably think that Australians and New Zealanders all know each other, and that's mostly not true. So there's a topographic theme running through my research that I'm going to talk about today. And that's not something that I set out to do, to be a topographer, but it's something that really emerged as a consequence as I sort of, retrospectively looked through my research. I see myself as a designer scholar, so I see it as my right to be able to explore many different topics and themes within the general rubric of landscape architectural design. And I've like to think I've done that in my research. So my talk today is structured around a series of what I'd call vignettes. So smaller little samples of larger works that I've sort of arranged into a narrative. I may not get through all of it, we'll see, but it doesn't really matter because it's more about the journey rather than the destination. And I'd rather you be interested along the way and wishing for more detail about something rather than be bored. And the other thing is that you can always refer to a recently published chapter of the same name of this talk, which is in a book called The Shape of the Land, edited by Mark Tribe. And at the end, I'll give references to some of my other publications that go into things in more detail. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about topography and my own topographies. So we tend to use topography as a synonym for landform, but a topographic map actually includes both natural and cultural features of the landscape. Topography combines the Greek topos, or place, with the Greek graphia, which means writing or recording or describing or drawing by lines or mapping. So I'd like to set the scene by briefly drawing some lines through the topography of my own place, just to kind of set the groundwork, and we'll actually come full circle by the end and it will make sense. And so I'd like to do this by talking through 3 topographic conditions that profoundly impacted me growing up and that definitely shaped my interest today. Don't worry, I'm not going to be showing you like, family slides or anything like that. I'll keep this brief, but hopefully it's interesting. The first topographic origin is growing up in a place called Kings Park, which is the vegetated hill that you can see over here. This is the 1,000-acre park at the heart of Perth, the city. It includes the State Botanic Garden and the herbarium, and the remaining 90% of it is natural bushland, and I say that in quotations. And it's natural in the sense that it was never cleared, but it is quite degraded by invasive species, particularly from Eastern Australia and from South Africa. And so we grew up as the only house in this park, in the gatehouse. My father started out with no English on the hole digging gang, so a kind of working topography, and worked his way up to head nurseryman and eventually to park superintendent. And so some of my earliest memories are actually answering the after hours phone to people who would call in and ask questions. The most common were, how big is Kings Park? Can you have dogs? And can you have weddings? And the answers in order are, it's 1,000 acres or 400 hectares. We would give it in both metric and freedom units. At the time, Australia was transitioning between the two. And yes, you can have dogs, but they have to be on a lead, and you need to book for weddings. And you can see here the topography of Kings Park is this sort of undulating sand escarpment. And the sand part is important because we'll come back to Perth at the end of the talk and talk about the sandy condition. And just to hold on this for just one more slide, my father was essentially an autodidact landscape architect in the sense that he had a drafting table in his office, and whenever an area of the park would need to be improved, and I use that term in the sense of an English garden being improving nature, he would draw it up and then give on-site direction to the teams who would go out and kind of make it. And he did have an unshakably Beaux Arts aesthetic, and let's just say that he missed the memo about modernism, and let alone postmodernism. And you can see the little gatehouse in this slide. It then got sort of extended and remade. And on the right is the same, like a matched photo, but it's grown up in the more contemporary time. The LA had grown up. Interestingly, I found out years later in a professional context that the family that lived in the house before us, the daughter became a landscape architect as well. So there's something in the air, or at least in the soil. It's on an axis. So at this end is the old Perth Observatory, and at the other end is the War Memorial, which if you looks out to the escarpment, which you can barely make out on the horizon, that almost looks like a line of clouds. And that escarpment is what's called the Yilgarn Block, which is this unfathomably ancient geological edge of the continent. Everything on this side of that is the sandy coastal plain, whose width ebbs and flows on a sort of cycle of 10,000 years. And certainly within Indigenous people's memory and stories. And the Yilgarn Block on the other side is this weathered granite that is immovable, essentially. Looking out east onto the escarpment segues into my next topographical influence, which is our family, I'll call them vacations in quotations, our journeys out into the bush or the outback. Which we would do in the Land Rovers from Kings Park, and indeed I still have one of those trucks. And out here, our topographic rewards would come in extremely small portions. In this ancient, worn-down landscape, it's the opposite of California in every way, in that there is no seismic activity. There were mountains, but they wore down millions of years ago, and so a small dry gully or an outcrop is all you get for your efforts. So in a sense, one learns to appreciate and read the nuances of the terrain. From the window of the Land Rover, I would always imagine that we were headed to some place with topography and with water and inhabitation. The fact that we had not passed another car on the track for a couple of days should have been a sign. It's kind of like the inland sea that the colonial explorations into the interior sought to find, but they were 100 million years too late and just ended up walking around lost. And in fact, that's what you can see on the right-hand slide is some of the ambles of the early colonial explorers. And as an aside, the Western deserts in Western Australia, where I'm from, are so remote that an Indigenous group that had no notion of the modern world remained uncontacted until 1984, which is just incredible. Although they had seen airplanes and, interestingly, rabbits, European rabbits, which had rapidly spread across the continent, had been part of their diet for 100 years. So rabbits were like the vanguard of European colonization in that sense. And then this leads me to my third topographic origin, which is the sport of orienteering. And this is the final one, so don't worry, which is this kind of bizarre sport where people run around in the forest navigating. You've probably heard of the term and you think of it as something more maybe military-like or something you do at school camp. It's actually an elite sport whose epicenter is the Scandinavian countries. I grew up doing this, and that was a big part of my formative years. And indeed, it turns out Kings Park, which you can see on the right, is an orienteering map, as it turns out. On the left is the terrain of the Yilgarn block that I talked about earlier, this kind of worn down granite topography with kind of wide open spaces. And so knowing one's own terrain is like the ultimate home court or home field advantage. You sort of know its structure, you know the lay of the land, essentially. As an aside, the strange table of symbols that you can see here is like an international code for describing where every checkpoint is. So I'm a little rusty, but look at the first one. It's like number 1, and then I think it's saying the northernmost cliff, 2.4 meters the foot of. So it's giving you clues essentially as you zero in on the checkpoint. And it's one thing to have your home court advantage, but then when you travel to other parts of the world, you have to adapt to their terrain. In a sense, as I've had to adapt to California's terrain when I moved here for this job. And on the right, you can see the ultra complex granite of Eastern Australia, which is much geologically younger than Western Australia. On the left, and I put this in for Sean, is New Zealand. Probably one of the flattest areas of New Zealand. It's a sand dune terrain on the North Island. And on the right is karst sinkhole terrain in Slovenia. Karst is limestone terrain, which is full of sinkholes because the rainwater, the acid etches out the carbon in the rock. So you get this kind of terrain of holes, and it lays waste to this old survivalist trope that if you're lost, all you need to do is follow water downhill. You know, you see it on survival shows. You follow a stream, it merges into a creek, into a river, and then people build their settlements by water. So eventually you will find salvation, or you'll be saved. But if you try to do that in karst terrain like we have here, you're just going to end up in a hollow or maybe even in a cave. And so that's on the left is Switzerland in the mountains. But anyway, these formative experiences influenced my interest in complex, nuanced landform. They influenced my interest in how human activity shapes landform and how landform shapes human behavior. As an example of behavior shaping landform, on the left is a stairway created by the passage of many feet at a site near me called the Albany Bulb, which is a very interesting site. I won't go into it. It's an old, what's called bay fill, like landfill out in the bay where they used to just, dump everything out in the water. And so old garden waste and construction detritus was dumped there. And then it became like a kind of clandestine art community and off-grid living area. But what's so interesting is how, to me anyway, how the passage of people going up a slope creates steps. So the kind of utility of leveling occurs just sort of footfall by footfall incrementally over time. On the right is a tourist map, which is like another version of this, but since we're also talking about maps, and you can see where the very information that would have been of use has been worn away through people's innate need to touch their current location. This need to link the ground and the map through their body. This particular one I came across in Chicago on a information board, but I encountered far more exaggerated examples in European cities and trailheads where the entire locale was obliterated, thus rendering the map useless. And I often think it's like a nice metaphor for the impact of over-tourism, that we kind of erode the very useful thing that we're going to see. And the flip side is an example of landform shaping behavior. Before we were talking about behavior shaping landform. And for landform shaping behavior, we're better than Gasworks Park in Seattle. where Richard Haag really captures the potency of topography as an unprogrammed, useless surface, open for interpretation. It is, to my mind, an example of what Kevin Lynch called uncommitted plastic forms that can adapt to a great variety of behaviours. And I think he's using plastic in a way that has largely fallen into disuse in English, because we see it more as in a material way now, but it's more in the way that it's malleable or flexible. Yeah. Or in another designed example from my professional career in Berlin, this is actually in East Leipzig, Park Rebiet. The path is embossed or imprinted into the landform, which is comprised of World War II rubble. It's almost like it reinforces the weight of human passage, or it's almost like a watercourse, the way it's kind of down, and the land almost sort of inflates on both sides of it. Or it's almost like a subtle version of the ancient hollowways that crisscross Europe, worn down by centuries of feet and hooves. Or from an artistic as opposed to design perspective, James Turrell's deployment of topography to create the effect that he terms celestial vaulting that distorts our sense of the curvature of the earth. This is Hemmelsgewölf in The Hague, which is like a mini version of Roden Crater, if you've ever encountered the ongoing development of that project near Flagstaff. His opus, that's not open to the public yet, although I have tried. They said I could have a peek, like a tour of it, but I would need to donate $10,000. So I politely declined, and I traveled to The Hague to see this mini version instead. Or sticking with coming from an artistic perspective, the work of Arakawa and Madeline Gins, who their wildly topographic kinesthetics, where they seek to rewire our very sense of space and time. They use complex topography to make what they term more body and less person. This is just one photo I took of the site of Reversible Destiny, which is in Yoro, which is in Gifu Prefecture in Japan. From memory, somewhere sort of like halfway between Nagoya and Osaka, and a really incredible place to visit if you're ever in that neck of the woods. And so I'll call these three examples, or these examples, non-dendritic landform, or more accurately, deranged landform, which is the geographic term, which is a really cool term, in that the ups and downs lack the branching structure formed by a water runoff, which is the left example is dendritic, that you can see here, because it has that conventions of water branching. And indeed, if you were lost in that terrain, you could follow the water to safety. The other examples are non-dendritic or deranged. And we usually associate this kind of landform with a porous substrata, such as landfill. Previous examples, I talked about the Bayfill, and even Gasworks Park is landfill. Or they're karst, and I mentioned that earlier, but they're also sand and lava, which I will come to in a minute. But first, I'd like to briefly discuss one of my garden projects that takes dendritic flow, like the example on the left, but literally reverses it. So this is the garden of the forking paths. This is a project, a little garden project I did with 2 graduate students for the Xi'an International Horticultural Expo way back in 2011. It was never intended, we had no idea that it was actually going to be built, although you will see that it was, with varying degrees of success. It was just a kind of workshop with different universities that kind of escalated. So it's not like we set out with a clear kind of sense of what we were doing. The expo is situated in an old quarry on the floodplain of the Chanba River, which runs through Xi'an. And in the collective Chinese imagination, rivers flow from west to east, from the plateau of the Himalaya down to the sea. But the Chanba River, upon whose floodplain the garden is situated, flows in reverse from east to west. So we took that, and we took that site-specific hydrological myth and conceptually reversed the automated tendency of water to converge, establishing in its place a system of divergent flows of both people and hydrology. And if you want to get really fancy and read it metaphorically as an allegory for life, the bifurcating flows question a worldview in which history converges into some kind of, you know, fate or meta-narrative. And so on the top, you can see one of the my early renders of it, and then there's actually one of the constructed photos below, which was mixed. They built the hardscape really well, as we'll see some other shots on the next slide, but unfortunately just didn't get around to finishing the planting, which was quite disappointing, given that it was even the planting on the boulevards into the expo was done more meticulously than this. So I don't quite know what went wrong. But anyway, you enter, it's framed by bamboo on two sides. That's at the highest corner, and you have these water runnels, and then there's a series of choices you basically have to make along the way as each one bifurcates. So essentially one path bifurcates into 30 by the time you get to the end. And then they also topographically separate like fingers that are dancing on a piano, I guess you could say. And some of the runnels that you can see on the side of each path also start to separate, which we can start to see in this slide, these little samples. So they start to lift off, or essentially the paths decrease more quickly than the runnels, because the runnels also have to always be going downhill because water is flowing by gravity in them. It turns out it's really hard to split or bifurcate water. Water does want to converge. It doesn't want to diverge. It's, you know, it's got its surface tension. Water molecules want to stick together, and also water follows the path of least gravitational resistance. So was it technically perfect? Not really, though it was interesting to see that people started unintentionally interacting with it and placing stones in the runnels to redirect water. So in that way, they were almost like sluices where you could get water to go into the different parts of the system. That's just an exploded axon. You can see the topographic, the very complex topographic form at the bottom. And I'm going to take this motif of divergent topography now and move from water to lava. See, it's always about the segue. This is the big island of Hawaii, which is compiled of 1 million years worth of accreted lava flows, the vast majority of which lies beneath the ocean like an enormous basalt iceberg. And these flows are, of course, ongoing, as evidenced by the 2018 eruption of Leilani Estates. It was all over the news back in 2018. And of particular interest to me was another estate named Kalapana Gardens, which was, and I say in quotations, wiped off the map by a 1990 eruption that buried the settlement under 50 feet of lava rock. And you can see on this plan the location of Kalapana Gardens. Leilani Estates is also there, and then the overlaying of the different flows that that make, you know, the island. These are not my photos, of course. It's taken from a textbook, but it gives a good kind of overview. Before the eruption, Kalapana was a lush residential subdivision of about 120 homes, with residents being a mix of mainland transplants and local Hawaiians. And you can see in the sequence, there is a horsed or an elongated rise here that acted as a kind of block. So it blocked the lava's flows to the ocean and caused it to pool laterally, which was bad news for Kalapana. And that's what eventually caused the complete inundation of the town site. And it pushed the coastline out by 1,000 feet. Incidentally, when land gets extended, in the US at least, the government gets ownership. It's not the adjacent landholders who get to annex the land. And so, of course, it was abandoned. It was unlivable. It was molten lava, but only for a while, because the thing is, while it was wiped off the ground, it wasn't actually wiped off the map. The legal ownership of each parcel endured, and the lot lines were simply projected up onto the new terrain, which is what you can see here in this, I guess we can call it an exploded perspective. You can see the kind of cadastra, or the plotted parcels underneath, and then the shape they take once they're draped onto the new terrain. You can see that at the top. And the result is this radically crumpled projection of parcels and rights of way onto a wildly amorphous, or to use the term we encountered before, deranged topography. And so if we zoom into one of my drone maps, whoops, wrong way, my mistake. If we zoom into one of my drone maps, you can see the negotiation between the rigid grid and realities of the new landform. Like, for example, you can see where once there was a straight road easement with a nice, neat street. Now there's just a kind of bulldozed track that squirms within it and abruptly ends at a lava shelf. And then there's some kind of little shortcut that is made. And where once, you know, backyards reverberated with games in suburban lots, now the deeply lobed terrain makes mere traversal difficult. You know, you're really limited to where you can walk. It's an incredible workout. And incidentally, when I was here doing all this and this field work, there was the really big eruption and there was an enormous earthquake. So actually, I had the drone up while these earthquakes were happening. That it was significant enough to knock me off my feet, and the whole place was evacuated. So they were quite intense times. But being the dedicated researcher I am, I stayed to get the shots. And so into this barest of frameworks, homesteading began with simple shacks that touched the ground lightly, with one eye on the volcano, an eclectic mix of shipping containers, old buses, tiny homes, flat-pack pole huts, and prefab greenhouses served as human landing pods. And even as the lava continues to crack and settle, each pod is like a life raft. They are self-sufficient because there are no utilities. This shot is literally a life raft. They are self-made because it would be so easy to overcapitalize in an uninsurable risk zone. And they are self-discovered because it takes a particular type of lava pioneer to willingly inhabit this basalt desert. Like proto-modernists, they seek to stay light, ready to leave at a moment's notice when the lava flows inevitably return. But it's interesting because the pull of the ground's gravity is compelling, and as time passes, people inevitably put down roots on the solid rock, and they'll inevitably step down from their landing pods and begin incrementally adapting the terrain. They will scrape and level and reshape it to make it usable and start to fashion gardens. We just can't help ourselves. We are, after all, as Anne Weston-Spurn observed, geological agents. Incidentally, the greenhouse that you see in this photo is not growing tomatoes or tomatoes. I'll leave it up to your imagination. They will step down from their landing pods and begin incrementally adapting the terrain. Whoops, I said that already. And I want to continue the theme of human geological agency, continuing with gardens and lava. But I'm going to move from the Pacific to the North Atlantic to a small island off the coast of Iceland. This is Jaime, which translates as home island. It's volcanic, of course, and straddles the diverging plates of the mid-Atlantic ridge. It is Iceland's most important fishing point until it almost wasn't, which is, seems to be the case with these lava islands. On a winter's night in 1973, a mile-long lava fissure unexpectedly opened up literally out of the blue. And within 5 hours, the island's 5,000 inhabitants had safely evacuated on the fishing fleet. Within days, a cinder cone that was later named Eldfell or Fire Mountain grew to over 500 feet high. As the eruption progressed, lava flowing at a rate of 20 feet per day threatened to inundate the town and block the entrance to the harbour, around which an entire community and economy was built. Yet instead of sailing away for good, a team of industrial geological agents famously dared to stand their ground and fight fire with water. The general strategy was to solidify lava into dams that would redirect the flows away from the town and the harbour. And astonishingly, it worked. When the eruption ended 6 months later, the island had expanded in area by 1/5. The town site was trimmed down by only 1/10. And not only was the harbour saved, its amenity was actually enhanced because the eruption had nourished a new breakwater that, created an improved, a more sheltered harbour from the Arctic storms. And you can see it here, the sort of aerial photo part is most of the new land from the eruption. And you can see the harbour in here. And as residents trickled back to the island and began to rebuild their lives, the question arose of what to do with the 500 acres of new ground that the eruption created. On a daily basis, islanders were faced with reconciling the landscapes of their memories with the menacing basalt mass that now loomed large on neighbourhood streets. To help re-establish their sense of place, residents were invited to adopt a patch of lava ground. But it was not an easy terrain to reconnoitre, since a side effect of rapid water cooling was to significantly amplify the jaggedness of the lava field. Persevering, local husband and wife Ellie and Guaja discovered and named a rock protrusion whose silhouette appeared animistic from certain angles. Around that basalt talisman, which they named the dragon, and you can see it there in the background, looks more like a puppy dog to me, they planned a lava garden. A deep dell offered some shelter from the incessant gales, and the ground, slightly warmed by trapped geothermal energy, nurtured more exotic botanica than would otherwise grow at this frigid latitude. Under their stewardship, some 100 species of plants would be cultivated there. Over time, they added paths, a gnome, a fish pond, a gabled wooden shed, several follies, and picket fences. First, though, they had to deal with enclosure. They had to keep the wind from stripping away the topsoil that they had laboriously carted in by hand. And the wind, I can tell you from first-hand experience, was wild. When I was doing this drone mapping, I came perilously close. My drone just started sailing off over the Atlantic Ocean. So I came perilously close to not getting it back. And so if we zoom in, we can see with the red lines the different forms of enclosure here, which is interesting. And so we're just going to unpack this a little bit and talk a little bit about garden enclosure. And it's interesting that the etymologies of garden and enclosure are entwined. They have essentially the similar meaning. A perimeter wall offers protection from weather, pests, and trespassers, and it helps to distinguish the cultivated from the wild, demarcating the line between the garden's fragile representation of nature and nature itself. As humanity's horizons expanded outward, the garden was progressively deconstructed, opened up, and ultimately transcended. We leapt the garden wall and came to see ourselves as part of nature and all of nature as a garden. And without going off onto that side note, there is, this history of garden enclosure that is quite interesting over time, from, the original cloister garden being fully enclosed and then opening up through the Renaissance and the Baroque and the picturesque, and then, transforming again within the modern garden, when it was more of a breaking down of the walls between the interior and the exterior, as opposed to the walls between the private and the public. And so they created this hybrid frame that was made up of fences, but also the topography to create the other two sides. So it's this topographic in walled frame to create this garden. And it's interesting, unlike those balancing rock cans that tourists erect by the thousands, a garden actually confirms a commitment to a place. You can't just build the can and move on. Once a garden is planted, the gardener must stay and shepherd the senseless growth, or soon the garden will go rogue. And yet, even as a gardener seeks to bend nature to their will, it still gets away from them. Gardeners may start out with a vision, but somewhat wonderfully, gardens never go to plan. Speaking of plans, when Anne Whiston Spurn termed us geological agents, she observed that the topography of settlements is constantly modified as hills are levelled and low-lying basins are filled. In Kalapana and Jaime, the two lava examples that we just saw in Hawaii and Iceland, digging and filling tends to remain the work of hardy individuals working on a human scale as a kind of labour of love. But when we get organized and start planning, given enough time and no threat of lava, our geological labor reshapes landforms on an industrial scale. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. Consider San Francisco, where the urban grid is famous for and contrasts with and expresses the underlying topography. As Florence Lipsky observed in The Grid Meets the Hills, the urban quality of San Francisco resides precisely in this incompatibility, this unthinkable defiance of nature. And you can see on the left is the topographic signature of San Francisco. It's kind of wild, isn't it? Expressing the grid and the way it's kind of almost a pixelation of the landscape, you know, creating those famous streets that go up at crazy angles. And then on the right is one of Florence Lipsky's original ink drawings of a piece of that, where it's expressed as a kind of, as an axonometric, essentially, just showing the streets and removing the land from the blocks. So it's like a topographic net. Or thinking of Hong Kong, where I did some research as well, where slopes up to a certain grade are built on, and particularly steep ground is artificially stabilized and classified within an engineering database of 60,000 registered slopes. And this is just a little piece of Hong Kong, but you can see all of the dark shaded areas are slopes, so topography that has been fortified in some way, and then the red lines are retaining walls. So this is this kind of infrastructure of topographic armament that allows the city to go up to the higher elevations. And they're serious about it. From memory, I took this, I think, in the Botanic Gardens, that, you know, they're serious about the kind of freezing of the soil to make sure it doesn't, you know, landslide away, which has been a real problem historically. And so despite having the densest urban districts on Earth, vestiges of landform are actually never far away. And in both San Francisco and Hong Kong, the robustness of the underlying geomorphology is such that it maintains its characteristics and resists erasure, which in turn drives the celebrated identity of each city. However, this sort of apparent, you know, this neat equilibrium between nature and culture is an exception rather than a norm. In contemporary urban growth, many cities around the world are breaching their natural limits of reasonably level and stable land for building. In Central and South America, frequently people of the lowest socioeconomic means are relegated to the steepest areas. You can see Bogota on the left and Rio on the right. In the American West, and it's the thumbnail, spoiler alert, in the American West, a reverse value system is in place, with wealth and elevation often closely aligned. Suburban sprawl increasingly encroaches into the peripheral foothills and is facilitated by mining scale, what's been termed mountain cropping techniques that permit flatland typologies to be constructed irrespective of the slope. Excuse me. Critiques that go you know, back as far as the 1960s described the earliest terracing in California as emblematic of environmental wastefulness in post-World War II industrial society. And while the conspicuous excesses of terracing may be illuminated in the flat, steep dualism that characterizes landscapes of the American West, elsewhere in the world, dismissing terracing is not really as clear-cut. In Japan, for example, in Nagasaki, in this slide you can see here, suburban development is adapted from pre-existing agricultural terraces. So they predated, and then the city expanded out onto them. So there was no new leveling. It was like an adaptive reuse of an existing artificial landform. Nor is suburban terracing necessarily simply solved by a policy of urban densification. In this example, also in Nagasaki, I was there for a student workshop several years ago, very interesting city. Even as an aging and shrinking population moves in from the surrounding hills to downtown, this is for easier access to services, new terrace suburbs are created on the periphery. I mean, there's some extreme differences here. It's hard to imagine how you can have a chat with your neighbor when they're 20 feet, 30 feet above you. And back, and we've come full circle now in Perth. There is also no flat land, steep land dualism, as is, in the American West, since the city is built on continuously undulating sand dune terrain. And this terrain has not hindered the rapid expansion of the metro area. The city actually extends over now maybe 150 kilometers along the coast, say 100 miles. And we're only seeing half the city in this map extract that I'm showing you here. And all of that coastal expansion has happened since World War II. Prior to World War II, the city was clustered around the river and turned its back on the coast because it's a modern leisure lifestyle kind of concept to be wanting to actually live by the beach, as kind of unpractical as that actually is. And for context, Kings Park, which I talked about at the very start of the lecture, is right here. And so you can see we've now zoomed out that same landscape. And I talked about the Yilgarn block on the horizon. That's everything you can see in the dense contour signature to the right. And the rest of it is the sandy coastal plain, which has all this sort of unregulated forms that are created mostly by wind. And in this context, to facilitate tract housing irrespective of the topography, the dunes are stripped of all vegetation and remodeled into megalithic benched earthworks of retaining walls and perfectly flat building lots. And you can see the indigenous coastal heath on the right-hand side. So they're not building into farmland like we saw earlier in Nagasaki. This is just into the coastal heath. Land that was never had a kind of a sort of functional use other than an ecological one. And when everyone lives in a stone fort, you don't have to be an urban design expert to question the quality of the urban environment and obstructed sense of community that results. As in, to a lesser extent than the one we just saw in Nagasaki, how do you chat to your neighbor when they are 15 feet above you? But it's interesting, leveling in itself, when you start to think about it, is not actually necessarily the problem. Indeed, leveling is this primal act of human inhabitation. And throughout history, leveling has been equated with usefulness. You level land to make it useful for industriousness, for agriculture, for an urban market square, or even, as our friend here is doing on the left, just to make a place to sleep comfortably for the night. Our inertial systems require us to sleep pretty much on level ground. And the designing planning disciplines are not much help either. This is the slide that you can see here on the right is taken from a landscape architectural textbook from the 1970s, Booth, I think. Yes, N.K. Booth, 1983 actually, but that was a reprint where there is a, building on sloped land creates a visual tension, which is alleviated if you flatten the land out to make a building pad. And, this is all very well for a one-off dwelling, but it escalates when there are many dwellings. And if we look at the three 20th century models of urbanism, they've sort of exerted little influence over this process of mechanized suburban transformation. The modern ideal of leaving the ground, that you could just, put buildings up on pilotis and then the landscape flows unencumbered beneath it. And you have density, so everyone's living in the tower, and then you can have the land to be open and shared, and the topography can do its thing, whether it's natural or otherwise. Had the unintended consequence of devaluating it when you sort of leave landscape without custodians. It so often became more of a wasteland than the modern pastoral ideal. Or traditional urban design, as practiced by the new urbanists and preached by Andre Duaney, who you may have encountered. Their widely adopted rural-urban transect assumes a flat urban core and a hilly wooded periphery. So topography in this model, and we can see it in the rural zone on the left of this slide, topography is constituted as an other outside of urbanism. The city is on the flat land, and your weekend hike essentially happens in the hilly rural zone. But if you do actual cross-sectional profiles through many cities, they reveal a far more complex relationship between topography, urban morphology, and urban legibility. And the third and final of the different 20th century planning models is ecological planning or suitability analysis, as preached by Ian McCarl, which then, was the prototype for all of GIS, essentially. They were using very early versions of geographical information systems. Ecological planning techniques were very effective at deducing where development should occur and where it shouldn't occur, such as you would avoid steep slopes and so forth. But it was less effective once the anti-development battle was lost and an area was going to be developed. It was less effective at saying how it might be done best. And so if we frame, try to drill in and frame in our remaining minutes. Sean, I'm assuming you want some minutes for questions. Is that right?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, so I'll try to wrap this up in the next few minutes so we can have 10 for questions. The problem is, well, a lack of available flat land. Urban densification and infill could be an answer, but the reality is cities will keep growing as well, even as we seek to infill them. A big influence on this sort of topographic leveling has been a change in plot ratios. And let me just unpack this a little bit. Plot ratio is the percentage of the surface area of a dwelling expressed as a percentage of the surface area of the plot that it's on. And you can see in these diagrams, which are taken from Australian data, but the story in the US is very similar. There's essentially a story since the mid-century of houses getting bigger and plots getting smaller for various reasons, which you don't need to get into. And what that essentially does is eliminate the space or the ground for topography to negotiate between house and lot lines. And so essentially the foundation or the plinth that each house stood on, whether it was on wooden stilts or like some kind of stone plinth, essentially that migrates from the base of the house footprint out to the perimeter of the lot, which is what you can see on the right-hand side. So that played a large role. Lifestyle programming and indoor-outdoor continuity, as a result of the popularization of modern design, modernism, where when you have a house that's flowing from indoor to outdoor and the levelness of the interior, it makes sense that levelness extends out. So the outdoors is no longer a place for, like having chickens and having your bore water and your clothesline, but it becomes a place for leisure that also increased the need for levelness. And of course, standardized housing, tract models, things like that also played a role in the standardization of essentially making the ground fit the house rather than the house fit the ground. There's some reasons for why we would do it that I'm just going to skip through. Maintaining vegetation. When you completely change the landform, all of the existing vegetation has to go. The soil is removed. The topsoil is often extremely old and is like a memory bank of like an ice core almost, a historical litmus that provides a window into past conditions, including fire regimes and climate change. So when you completely dig it up, you lose that memory bank, that institutional knowledge, as it were. You also lose what I term the phenomenological value of rough landform. This example is really interesting. This is just near me in the Berkeley Hills, and you can see it's through this process. Went through a process of leveling for for suburban development. It's wilder in Contra Costa County. Let's go back. It took, I watched it, photographing it in the hills for a few years. And, you know, this is to say that the inherent variation typically associated with natural topography bears innate value in terms of how humans physically, psychologically, and creatively interact with their environment. It helps us to orient, or what Kevin Lynch called topographical gradients, and they're lost when we level the land. Which leads me to the final little case study, which gets kind of technical, and so I'm not going to have time to go through it, but maybe I'll do like a 30-second version of it. And as I've said, I'll show some readings at the end, where if you're interested in anything, you're welcome to kind of, you know, pursue them and read my publications. Basically, I sort of put, you know, where the rubber hits the road, then experimented with how we might actually change these practices at a quite pragmatic level, like trying to engage industry rather than a kind of like a high level academic level of kind of wishful thinking. And I was heavily influenced by understanding the different typologies over time of how the city evolved and how topographic manipulation changed. And I'll just decode this very quickly for you. So essentially going through the years, on the left is my reconstruction of what the original topography was. You can see on the left of these. And then the next middle slide is the modified topography. And you can see as we go through the decades, from the 30s to the 40s, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, up to the 2000s, the modification becomes more intense, to the point where the current landform bears no relation to the original landform at all. So I went through a series of, did a series of scenario modeling where I modeled the proposed design for this suburb that is actually still being constructed today as we speak, and experimented with different scenarios where I experimented with different housing types, different layouts, different bringing back, you know, trying to reenact old forms of development and seeing if they could be adapted to the present day, and always including these visual impact assessments, these little perspectives as well of what the appearance would be on the street. This is an example of trying to just maintain a key topographic feature at the trade-off of just doing conventional terracing everywhere else. This is trying to maintain the swales and so on and so forth. And, you know, the conclusions really quickly is that it comes down to, well, new housing typologies, experimenting with them is an important one. You know, we have these wonderful architectural examples of these houses that, you know, touch the earth lightly, but they tend to be bespoke residences for privileged clients on, you know, remote lots. The one on the left is by the famous architect Richard Laplastria, and I'm fortunate enough to visit that little place. But as yet, nobody has been able to kind of bring that to bear at a sort of, you know, a larger suburban scale. So that remains untapped in design terms. And the second one is a diversity of lot sizes and housing typologies, and, you know, getting away from this kind of uniformity and repetition. And there's a really strong demographic argument for having a diversity of housing types and lot sizes, and that is, you know, increasingly living arrangements amongst populations of both the US and Australia don't fit neatly into 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom homes on 5,000 square feet. And so having a diversity of dwelling types actually could have the unintended benefit of also allowing a diversity of topography in terms of, you know, the two might be calibrated in some way. And, you know, it's all better than the current state of the art in northern Perth, which is total levelling, where they're actually advertising this development as having no retaining walls because they were people started to understand them as being bad. So instead, they just levelled the entire thing, just removed all of the dunes. And they do indeed have no retaining walls, but they have no topography either. So on that maybe less positive note, it's time to end. happy to take any questions about anything I said or didn't say.
Questions?
Do I need to get up?
No, you can say it. Camera should follow.
So I was curious, how do you believe that topography should be considered in the creation of zoning laws? And if so, how do we communicate the importance of topography to not only urban planners, but lawmakers?
Yeah, I mean, they're good questions. Yes, I do, but I guess I haven't got to that level of policy yet. You know, that's just a really good question. The actual mechanisms for doing that, I don't know, I can't answer for you now. And maybe that's something you can think about in your own in your own work, in your own career, how to actually do that. There's, you know, every jurisdiction has its own impediments and its own, you know, systems in place that kind of stand in the way. So it would be a long process and a breaking down of many different, you know, from infrastructure design is a huge one. The norms of real estate are a huge one. This expectation that everybody has a view, you know, and then, you know, designing around that. Standards of road grades and things and crossfalls. All these things would need to be incrementally adapted in some way. And the notion of value adding or not undercapitalizing, so that, you know, if you don't build a 3-bedroom, 5-bathroom or whatever home, you're undercapitalizing on a lot, would also have a role. But also the idea that downtowns don't necessarily just need to happen down on the, you know, the flat land, and there could actually be a range of services in hillier areas as well. So that's a sort of rambling answer, but I don't have an exact answer for you. It's complicated, I'll say, in summary.
Thank you.
Irene, any questions? Oh, yeah. Kate?
So when you're doing those scenarios, I don't know if you, did you have a way of like quantifying what topographical features were like important, I guess, or like which ones you were highlighting, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I did sort of go through and do a like an editing process or like an analysis, I guess, of them, which I didn't really talk about today. If I can go back to the slides, where each one I did a kind of a visual impact assessment. I did a sort of sheer volume of earth that was moved. So the grading calculations. So I filtered all these metrics through, and then also like a quality of there's a nostalgic aspect to it as well, like a quality of residential experience. That's certainly for many West Australians, at least, that sort of, and you'd have it in parts of this country too, that sort of seaside environment of a sort of more laid back way of living. In older sort of pre-Second World War suburbs. So these were all sort of metrics that I was considering in which ones might be more effective or less effective.
Last chance for a question. Minto?
Has Peter Bosselman impacted your work at all?
Yeah, I mean, he was my close colleague for many years, and I, you know, taught with him in the Masters of Urban Design program as well. So definitely my work in San Francisco and his work on topography was definitely influential. If not explicitly, in that I'm not sort of like building off his work and I didn't directly work with him on any projects, but definitely more implicitly in his approaches. He's retired now. He retired a couple of years ago, so we don't see as much of him anymore. But yeah, he left a large imprint on myself and on the Masters of Urban Design program.
I see a lot of similarities between the work of yours and Peter's.
Interesting. Good observation. Yeah, well picked.
All right, well, let's give Karl another round of applause.
Thank you, everyone.
busy schedule in the morning over on the West Coast. And I will catch up with you at another time to carry on our conversation from earlier.
Enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you.
Yeah.